My name is Max Younkin. I'm a retired professional forester. Worked for the Forest Service for 41 years. Well, I was raised in Iowa and mainly around farming communities. Even though I lived in town, my family loved the outdoors. We hunted, fished, camped. My family, my father and myself and my brother were all active in Boy Scouts, so that had a significant influence on my career. All of the aunts and uncles and grandparents were all farmers, so we really associate with the agricultural farming community, and had a big influence, I think, on my life. My hometown, I had two towns that I was raised in: Ogden, Iowa, which is in south central Iowa, and Marshalltown, Iowa is the town that I graduated from high school. Lorimor, which was in Union County in southern Iowa, is more of a farming community. Marshalltown was light industry and farming community too, but it was a town of about 25,000 people. Well, after graduating from high school, I went into the Army for 2 years, and I had decided that when I was a sophomore in high school that I wanted to be a forester. So I really started preparing for classwork and things like that I was interested in, that I thought would help me out in that long-term career aspiration. And of course, my first job opportunity that was given me was California, and so that's where I ended up my whole career. I'm not sure for me personally whether the military had any impact on me being in forestry or in college, but they used to say that, and I was in the military right after the Korean War, at the end of the Korean War in 1954 through 1956. And they used to say, and there were a lot of us then that came back from the Army or wherever, military service, and went to college. And they used to say that they thought the guys from the military that come back to school were a little more focused than the average student. Whether that was true, I don't know that that was for me personally, but I certainly had some obligations at that time because I was married and had 2 children. And living in married housing on the campus in a Quonset hut that was provided by the Army from World War II. So a lot of other experiences tied in with that, but I think to that extent, I was very focused on what I needed to do in 4 years of college. I graduated from Iowa State University in 1961 in forest management option. We had 2 options, either forest utilization or timber management option. And so I chose the timber management option, which is more of a generalist type of an education. And I actually was fortunate at the time. I had several different job opportunities in those days, which is kind of rare compared to, I think, today's graduates. I had a job offer from the BLM, but I decided that BLM, I had heard the guys that had worked for BLM in the summertime spent a lot of their time in town. And I thought my dad and we'd always talked about going to the wild and woolly West. And in 1954 and those days, why I hadn't been out of the state of Iowa, so that sounded pretty glamorous to me, to be a forester and to go out west. And so I chose the Forest Service, and my first job opportunity, as I said, was in California. One of the reasons that I might have alluded to earlier that I wanted to work for the Forest Service was that my seasonal job on the Kootenia National Forest in Montana, I had a ranger that really believed in training young foresters. So even though I was hired as a marking crew foreman, I had 8 people working with me, and we were responsible for marking trees. And at that time, even starting out in my career, on that particular ranger district, we had a huge bark beetle infestation that killed all of the spruce. And so it was an interesting job trying to manage the marking. So I was talking about the importance that this district ranger gave for training new foresters. And as I said, even though I was hired as a marking crew foreman, various jobs throughout the summer, this ranger would assign me various tasks. So I'd spend a couple of days out with the recreation people doing recreation jobs in campgrounds. I spent a couple of days with the blister rush crew, grubbing ribes. I spent a couple of days in a lookout. I spent a couple of days with the engineers, and that went on all summer. And one of the aspects, one of the situations that was taking place that summer was we had a lot of dry lightning with no rain. So I probably spent half of my time fighting fires. And even we had one larger fire on the Ranger District of about 250 acres. So even though I was on the line part of the time digging fire line, the ranger had me doing timekeeping for a day or so. He had me running a sump pump, a relay sump pump for a couple of days. I was driving a 4-wheel drive pumper wagon for a couple of days. And so I really appreciated and learned a lot about the Forest Service program by his training priorities. And I remember when I went back to school, some of my classmates had spent the summer doing on the blister rust program, grubbing ribes, and that's all they did all summer. They would get down on their hands and knees, run through a rope line. They'd have to map every single piece of ribes that they pulled out of the ground. And I remember one individual, one student, telling me that that's what forestry was about. He didn't want anything to do with it, so he quit. He not only quit working for the Forest Service, he quit school. So I felt very fortunate that this ranger made a high priority in the various training that he gave me over the summer. Where you actually dig out and cut off the ribes stem, and then they'd spray it with herbicide. It's a alternative host to the sugar pine blister rust that kills sugar pine. And so they had a heavy program. Like I said, they had 50 men involved in that program. And every day, 8 hours a day, they'd go out to the field where they had these units set up where they would dig out the ribes plants and spray them with herbicide. And so all day long for 8 hours, they'd be down on their hands and knees, grubbing and mapping, which was very boring. I had 2 days experience, and that's all I wanted of grubbing ribes. So anyway, I was extremely appreciative of the effort that this ranger took in providing me a broad experience. And that was probably the major reason that I decided that if I had an opportunity, I wanted to work for the Forest Service. I thought California was really awesome. We came over the Donner Summit in the springtime, and the summit was actually packed, had about 15 foot of snow on it in June, which of course to me was unusual. And then as we came down the west slope of the mountains, we saw that the orange blossoms were in bloom, and we could smell the blossoms as we were driving down the highway. It was before the freeway was constructed. This was Interstate 80, and we could smell the blossoms So that really impressed us. And then as we began to drive further north, because my first assignment was on the Klamath National Forest in Northern California, as we began to move further north, well, it got drier and browner. And so it was kind of an interesting contrast from Iowa. And my wife being from Virginia, everything is green there. So she was slightly surprised as we began to drive further north and saw all of the brown semi-desert area around Wairika. Well, I started out with my career on the Klamath National Forest and spent about 10 years there, both in the supervisor's office as well as 2 different ranger districts. And then from there, I moved to the Six Rivers National Forest, which was just about 8 miles further down the Klamath River. And most of my time spent there was in various timber activities, timber sale preparation, sale administration, and silviculture, some of those activities. Then from there, from Orleans on the Six Rivers, and I was one of those foresters that was a true forester, I guess, I would say, in my terms, and said I never wanted to go to Southern California. Well, lo and behold, they sent me to Pasadena on the Angeles National Forest. So I spent 2 years on the Angeles National Forest, and turned out to be one of the best career steps in my whole career. I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed working with the people that you find in the LA basin. I didn't particularly like the smog and the cement and all of that, but the challenges there were really great. And from there, I got a ranger district job then on the Tahoe National Forest on the east side at Sierraville, and spent 5 years there. And from there, I moved down to the Sierra National Forest in timber management and spent 20 years there. So that kind of summarizes or highlights at least the areas that I've been. Well, not necessarily challenges, but I think some of the things that I remember from the Klamath National Forest and the Six Rivers, about 80% of the folks that worked there worked in timber management. And about 80% of our budget seemed to me like it was tied to the timber program. And then the timber program sort of financed road construction, any money left over that we could do wildlife work or watershed work. So that was a fairly significant difference between then and nowadays. One of the things that I really enjoyed, when I was on the Klamath, we had a program that pretty much the district timber management staff ran. I remember I went out with my boss on several occasions and actually flagged in the roads. We didn't have engineers that were available to flag and design roads, but so we actually went out and flagged the roads to be used on the timber sale program. And that's certainly different from the way things are nowadays too. Today you've got specialists, the engineers on the forest do all of the road flagging, all of the road design, all of the construction administration, those sorts of things. So that's a significant difference. One thing that I really enjoyed about the Six Rivers was that when I went there to Orleans Ranger District, we started implementing a total sale design in which we went in on a subdivision or sub-watershed and actually totally designed on paper using aerial photographs all of the entire road system, the entire cutting units. And to me, that was really a big change and a big benefit. Also, at that time when I was on Orleans, I utilized the district staff and their specialty interests like wildlife and watershed and recreation to incorporate into the sale design and sale planning, which was a real benefit. So I really enjoyed that aspect where it was more of a total environmental approach to timber sale design. And so that was a significant change from the 10 years that I'd spent on the Klamath River and the Klamath National Forest. One thing that I thought was interesting when I was working at Happy Camp was that they gave me the assignment of being a timber sale administrator. And I had had absolutely no training whatsoever in timber sale administration. And they assigned me to 10 timber sales, which nowadays, under the certification program, is totally bizarre and unheard of. That district at that time was ranked in the top 10% of the nation in terms of harvest, and we had 55 million board feet a year. So, as I was saying, when being assigned 10 timber sales, and I was not only administering the timber activities, but I was also administering all of the road contracting, which is unheard of today. Today we've got administrators for roads and administrators for the timber side. So it was really an impossible task, and I didn't hear any direct feedback from the region or anybody else about that, but I suspect those kind of situations is why the region went to a certification program where nowadays they pretty much restrict sale administrators to 2 or 3 sales a piece. It's impossible to do a good job of sale administration if you've got that many timber sales active at one time. So you need to have good coverage and good accountability under the contract. And so that's the reason they restrict generally administrators to 2 or 3 sales. One of the projects that I can remember, one of the programs that was implemented at the time when I was on the Klamath River, and I think this policy came down from the Washington office as well as through the regional office, was that they were starting to implement scenic aspects to all of our project design. And we were doing clear cutting in those days, and the clear cuts were anywhere from 20 to 30 acres, which were fairly good size compared to what we do now. When they started implementing the scenic management program, I discovered that one of the timber sales that we had laid out had a 20-acre clear cut facing the highway, Highway 96, just bald face about a quarter of a mile. You drive down the highway and look straight at this clear cut. So I decided after the fact that one way to maybe mitigate some of the scenery problems tied with that was I changed the contract through a modification to allow the purchaser to tractor log that instead of cable logging. All of the units in that steep country were mostly cable logged high lead system. And so I allowed them to tractor log it, which didn't have the impact of removing all the material. And the understory was basically heavy tan oak and madrone understory. And then every two years after that, I had them go in afterwards and inject the trees to kill the tan oak and the madrone with herbicide. And so that when you drove down the highway, you really couldn't even tell that it was a clear cut. And by timing the killing of the madrone and tan oak over a period of 2 or 3 years, there was only part of the trees that were dead in any given year. So it gave the effect that when you drove down the highway, you really couldn't tell there was a clear cut there, which I thought was, I felt kind of proud of the fact that we had implemented that policy, at least in that one area, after the fact, and was pretty successful at achieving our scenic goals. One of the other things that I can remember with some frustration and some pride, when we were laying out a timber sale on the Six Rivers National Forest, we had actually had the landscape architect come out and look at our clear-cut designs to mitigate the negative scenic aspect of aircraft flying over the top of the clear cuts. And this was on a flight from San Francisco up to Portland, so they would fly over that part of the Ranger District, and you could look down and you could see patterns of clear cuts. So we had a landscape architect come in and help us design to mitigate some of the negative impacts. And that was really a challenge, because when you're using cable systems, those cable lines run straight up and down the slope. So it's really difficult to design how the end product of a given clear cut to help meet those objectives. A couple of highlights for me on my work on the Angeles was my work with the film industry. And as a resource officer, I was responsible for coordinating with filming that was done on the Angeles National Forest, and there was quite a bit of that because of our proximity to the film industry. So I remember going out with the film industry, and they'd be on the highway or somewhere in the forest doing their filming, and I'd have to make sure they were protecting the resources that were there. They'd want to cut down a tree or some bushes, or they'd want to run a car into a guard railing and do some damage. So I had to make sure that they weren't overdoing it, and if they did damage, they had to repair it within a reasonable amount of time. And one kind of funny side aspect of that was, to me, they must have had dozens and dozens of specialists. They had one guy that would just do the lighting. There was somebody that would work in the camera. They had all kinds of specialists out there on the setting. And they'd bring up a cook station, and they'd cook steak for lunch, and they'd all eat steak. And of course, being the administrator, well, I was there eating steak along with them. So it was kind of an interesting aspect of my job there. One individual I remember was Jason Robart, and he was filming some murder mysteries. And I think Carol Burnett was doing some filming too. So those are the two people that I had a chance to meet. And I'd started out initially being assigned as the administrator for the Lassie program, and they decided that they wanted more than just a lowly GS-11 administering that program, so they assigned somebody from the Washington office to coordinate the Lassie program. So I didn't get involved in that too much. One of the other interesting jobs I had was administering electronic sites on the Angeles. And I used to say at one time that they had more electronic towers on the forest than they did trees, which really wasn't true. But it was an interesting job, and one that I had no experience in doing. So they had, at Mount Wilson, they had all of the major industrial radio stations, NBC, ABC, television stations, and all of those. And then on Mount Disappointment, which was another mountain a few miles away, they had all of the more sensitive electronic sites, the FBI, the CIA, the Sheriff's Department, the city police, sites like that. So that was an interesting job. One thing, though, that I found the same, no matter where you go, it was about protecting natural resources. So even though management on the Angeles National Forest was significantly different than my job on the Klamath, it was really about protecting the natural resources that exist there. So the job was really challenging, and I thought it was an interesting place to work. When I was on the Klamath in the 60s, and when I was doing, when I was assigned to the supervisor's office, when I first started my career, I was doing continuous forest inventory. And I had to do practically 50% of that job was photo interpretation of timber out in the field to assess what the timber resource looked like over time, maybe 30, 40, 50 years. So when I went to the Ranger District, I loved looking at aerial photos for planning timber sales. I had a boss that told me, Max, if you spend more than 4 hours looking at aerial photos to plan this timber sale, I'm going to fire you. And so that was a pretty significant change, going from that management climate to the one on the Six Rivers at Orleans Ranger District, where we did the total sale design using aerial photographs to design the road system, the preliminary road system, and the preliminary cut units. One of the fun things for me, I think, was I was showing off my skills with a bow and arrow. And we had a garbage dump behind the ranger station about a quarter of a mile. And we knew skunks and bears came in there every night. So I went down there one evening and shot this skunk. And I brought it over to the compound where all of these fabric tents were. And I was going to skin it. And I knew, I was aware of the scent glands. I thought I could do it. Well, I made a mistake and cut the scent glands. The scent sprayed all over my clothes, all over my face and my hair. And I decided, well, I better take a quick shower. And I went into the shower. The showers in those days had wooden slats in the floor. And of course, that smell permeated the wooden slats. I was a total outcast. The whole camp, the tents were permeated with skunk smell. And I had assured everybody that I could do this with no problem. And so I was an outcast for probably 2 weeks. And they had to rebuild, they had to throw away all the wooden slats in the shower and rebuild them. We had a Russian bull cook who cooked all of the meals and took care of the camp, and he spoke very little English. But I very well understood him that I was never to do that again. And I hung my clothes out on the line then for probably 2 or 3 weeks. I washed them in tomato sauce, which was supposed to be one of the remedies. It didn't work. So I finally threw away my jeans and my shirt. And so that was something that I never forgot, and nobody else in camp let me forget for the whole summer. One of the more enjoyable aspects of my job, especially when I was on the Tahoe, we had one of the largest range programs on the National Forest. And so, as I said, I enjoyed meeting the ranchers and setting up their management programs for the summer and where they would be grazing on National Forest land. And one of the more enjoyable jobs I had was going out with my resource officer and riding horseback up in the high meadows to make sure that the cattle were in the right place and that their salt licks were placed properly and we weren't getting any resource damage. So even though I really wasn't an expert horseman, that was one of the more enjoyable jobs that I had on the Tahoe National Forest, and really enjoyed the sociability and the professionalism that ranchers had in grazing on the National Forest. And when I was on the Younkin district on the Klamath, I had two permittees, and one other time that the ranger went up with me on the wilderness to view the cattle allotments. I remember we'd been riding quite a bit, and I had my old Forest Service felt hat on. We came back down to the ranger station after we had done the field review, and after being in the saddle, we unloaded the horses out of the trailers in the compound. I put my hat on the ground, and the horse immediately relieved himself on top of my hat, which I never wore again. Well, one of the situations that when I was on the Angeles National Forest and one of the jobs being on a fire management team that I had, that was pretty scary, and several of us went up in a helicopter to view and do a recon report on the activity of the fire and the movement of the fire. And as we were, this was on the San Jacinto mountain south of Los Angeles. And as we were coming back down, the pilot said, "Whoops," and he said, "My oil pressure is dropping," and we ended up auto-rotating with a pretty hard landing, and I swore I was never going to get in another helicopter. And what he discovered that in the maintenance of the helicopter, they forgot to put the oil plug back on, and so the helicopter was spurting oil out through the port, and so that was a job that even though I enjoyed fire management, that was pretty scary. When I was on the Younkin district, one of my jobs as a resource officer was managing the range, which wasn't a big program. We had 2 permittees up in the Marble Mountain Wilderness area. And I remember one time we were going up into the wilderness to review and see what was going on and where the cattle were. And I remember my district ranger at the time was not a horseman. So he was really struggling just to ride on the flat. Well, unfortunately, a bee stung his horse, and he took off running. My ranger was waving his arms, screaming his head off. He stayed on, which I have to give him credit for that. But that was one aspect that I remember that was somewhat unique and funny. We kidded him a lot, but it was just all part of the job. He swore he was never going to get on another horse or go up to the wilderness with me again on horseback. That was one of the significant things that I saw in my career in 40 years. When I was on the Klamath National Forest in the 60s, as I recall, we only, outside of timber folks and engineers, we had 1 wildlife biologist and 1 range con. And all of those folks were male. We had no females in the field. So that's been a significant change. When I got to the Six Rivers National Forest, they finally hired a geologist that went out with us to help design timber sales. And it was a very important and significant aspect of bringing specialists into the field because of all the graphitic schists and all of the slide activity that went on with the heavy rainfall and those types of soils in designing timber sales. And I really learned a lot from the geologists at that time. And I recall also when I was on the Tahoe National Forest, we had no specialists at the district level. This was in 1975, except engineers. And I like to think, if I recall this correctly, I was one of the first rangers to build a job description for archaeologists, wildlife biologists, and a range con at the district level in this region. And I worked pretty hard to develop those job descriptions, had to go clear back to Washington to get approval by Office of Personnel Management to get those approved. They were very significant specialty jobs that were important to help us design projects tied in with the environmental requirements. And so I thought that was really important change. One of the other aspects that's somewhat tied in with this was when I was on the Klamath, they had a very significant prescription burning program. And at that time, when we went out to do our prescribed burns on my district, it was about 800 acres a year, everybody on the district was required to be involved in that program. So there were no specialists at all. We had a fuels manager on the district who actually set up the projects and the burning prescriptions. But it's interesting nowadays that that's pretty much all done by fire people and fuels management specialists. You have no other biologists or foresters involved in that aspect of the program. So that was, I think, an important aspect, a starting of the changes that were beginning to take place in the national forest. And I think in many ways it's unfortunate, even though we have good specialists that provide meaningful information through managing the forest, national forests, in some ways it's unfortunate that we've become so specialized that we all don't get involved as a team in that effort. So I see that as kind of one disadvantage. Well, one of the aspects that I really enjoyed, and I didn't get involved in this to any extent until I was assigned on the Angeles National Forest, was I was assigned to a fire team. And I really appreciated all of the cooperative effort that was put into managing wildfires with the state, the cities, the Forest Service, the CDF. To me, it was one of the more gratifying jobs that I ever was associated with in the Forest Service, to have that whole team approach to managing wildfire. You had specialists that really knew their job, but it was very gratifying to me to see that kind of, everybody knew their job, the task got done, and done fairly efficiently with not a lot of oversight from 3 or 4 layers throughout the organizations. So to me, that was a great example of good teamwork that was really effective. I think there are certain species that require sunlight, and so clear cutting is appropriate. We've gone from larger clear cuts, like I mentioned before, the 20 and 30 acre ones, down to very small ones where we do that, and we have to have special authority to do any kind of clear cutting on the forest now. But those are appropriate in certain areas, and when you look at what goes on in nature, there are clear cuts out there naturally where you have over-mature stands of trees that are dying out. You've essentially got a clear cut, or where you've had old burns, you have clear cuts. So anyway, it is appropriate. The clear cutting we're doing now, at least on the Sierra National Forest, are very small areas that try to replicate what you see in nature. So they're probably anywhere from 2 to 3 acres. So significant change from the 30 acre ones that we did up in Northern California. And a lot of that has to do with cable logging systems that are appropriate on steep ground. You don't have a lot of choice in terms of when you design a cutting unit, what you can do with the cable system. So I think that's the main difference. Silviculturists could probably describe that better than I have, but okay, what that involved was a proposal by the Disney Corporation to build a year-round recreation ski resort at Mount Lolo on the Sierraville Ranger District. And you probably remember they had the same kind of a project proposal at Mineral King, and it was so controversial that they had to pull out of that. And the land management plan that the Truckee Sierraville Ranger District was putting together pretty much implemented or said it was okay for that kind of recreation use on Mount Lolo. So that was kind of the guiding policy. And it was, as I said, it was extremely controversial. You had a group on one side that were for it. Some of the local conservation organizations were against it. The businesses in Truckee, Sierraville, Loyalton area, of course, were in favor of it because they could foresee it bringing additional income to the economy of Sierra County, which is a very small county, and had trouble with their economics anyway. And looking back on that, when you look at the economy of Sierra County now, of course they lost the timber mill, the lumber mill that was there. And so they really don't have much diversity. It's basically a ranching community, which is great. But they're struggling, I think, financially, trying to make things work. And unfortunately, Disney pulled out of that project proposal because of all of the controversy and the expense that they had gone through in developing all of their proposals. I was disappointed as a forest manager because we were in the process of doing an environmental impact statement, and so they didn't really let the process work. So there was no final decision that came out of it through a environmental statement. So anyway, that was one of the interesting. The Disney Corporation, of course, was the proponent, but the base facilities for the ski resort, for example, and the year-round destination resorts would have been on private land around Independence Lake, and the ski area, ski runs, would have been on national forest land. So it would have been a combination between private land interests and forest land management, and so it would have been a good cooperative project, I think. But like I said, I was disappointed that they pulled out before they actually let the full environmental process work. And at this point, who knows what the outcome of that would have been. But anyway, one of the interesting management jobs on the Tahoe National Forest that I had. Well, there's been a significant change. I spent 20 years on the Sierra National Forest, and one of the things that I was proud of, and I had the responsibility of coordinating the timber prep program on the forest, as well as the sale administration, and so I was fairly proud of the fact that in the 20 years that I was on the forest, we didn't have a single appeal through the bid process or the environmental process. But it wasn't long after before things really hit the fan, a couple of years after I retired, which I guess was a good thing for me. Yeah, the spotted owl issue, which was one of the big controversies in the region, in fact, all over the West Coast, really had a significant impact on the timber program. As you've already know, it pretty much reduced the timber management program, as well as all of the staffing tied in with that program, about 75% across California, Oregon, Washington. So that really had a significant impact. We had, I think, 4 active lumber mills going on the forest. Now we have none. The closest one we have is at Sierraville, which is a couple hours south of here. So it really had a significant impact on our program for managing the forest. One of the emphasis, which I think is important, is the collaboration that is required to go through a project plan. And I think it is important. I think it's necessary, but it's a very expensive process, very time-consuming. But I think it's been a beneficial aspect of the management that we're trying to do on the National Forest now. Well, I think as a result of the collaborative process, it's been more and more difficult to manage the timber aspect of the National Forest. what people like to see generally, from what I've heard, is an open forest, old growth stands that are clear and open, park-like. and that kind of equates to maybe 50 or 60 trees per acre out there. But if you drive up any of the roads in the forest now, what you see is anywhere from 300 to 600 trees per acre. And now that we have the drought and the insect infestation with all the dead trees, it's just a matter of time before a fire goes through there and burns everything up. And it would be extremely difficult to manage the fire with that kind of fuel loading. One of the things that I remembered in my 40 years when I started my career, all of the data that we collected had to be done by hand. So when we went out and cruised timber sales to determine the amount of volume in a timber sale, it all had to be done. We'd go to a book with tables, volume tables, and had to do everything by hand. All of the appraisal work that's done to determine the value of timber before we would sell a timber sale was all done by hand. All of the volume accountability as logs ran through the sawmill where we'd scale them, and that was the basis in which we charged the timber purchasers for money, all had to be done by hand. All of the environmental analysis and write-ups that got done was all done by hand, and a typewriter if one was available. And when I retired, everything was computerized. Nothing, and in some ways, that was a real benefit in building some efficiency into the program, but in other ways, it tied foresters to the desk that they didn't want to be tied to. Foresters are field people, and so a lot of them really kind of resented being tied to a desk any more than necessary. I think forestry really you have to be passionate. There's not big money in that, as probably any student knows. So you really have to be passionate about wanting to deal with the environment. And I always used to say that I didn't become a forester to cut trees. My perspective was really to manage the total environment. That's one of the things that I really liked about my job when I was at Orleans, to look at the total management of the timber sale program and its benefits for all of the resources. And that's also one of the good aspects that I liked about my job when I was on the Tahoe as district ranger. The job at Sierraville involved managing both east side timber and west side timber. And it had a well-balanced workload. It had a pretty good fire workload. We had a good watershed, wildlife, timber, and recreation. So I really enjoyed that aspect of managing that particular ranger district. That's an interesting question. I like to stay optimistic that through all of the collaboration and the specialists that are involved now in national forests, that we'll be able to effectively manage the forest. I think the key is to get Congress involved so that they appreciate the true value of the national forest system throughout the United States, to provide budgets that are effective in being able to do the job of managing the forest. And the drought and the beetle infestation that we're having locally here in the southern Sierras is a good example. I think that it's going to take leadership from Washington, from our regional office, state offices, to really get on top of this. Right now, personally, what I see going on with the drought and the heavy bark beetle infestation is truly an environmental disaster. And I see leadership taking, I guess, my bias, a very slow reaction to solving that problem. And it's going to be a long-term problem. It isn't going to be a problem where Congress says, we'll give you some money next year. This problem is going to take years. And especially if we get some big burns in some of these dead areas, that's even going to exacerbate the whole issue. And so when you think that a lot of these trees are old-growth trees that are 200 years old, this is going to be a long-term effort to get on top of the problem that we have. And I think one of the keys is to be able to go out and thin the forest so that we don't have all of the stress tied in with trees with the drought or insect infestations. I can't imagine a professional forester not belonging to SAF. And I'm not getting paid to make that statement. Beyond me to think that forestry is our profession and the SAF is our professional organization. And I really learned so much being involved with that. Just keeping up, especially since I've been retired, just keeping up to date with things that are going on in forestry. I think I've always found it really beneficial to be involved with various foresters from various organizations, whether it's private industry or CDF or Forest Service and students and student organizations. To me, not only professionally learning some new things as a result of their involvement, but just the sociability of that kind of involvement. And so I would sure advocate, and I honestly don't know why there are a lot of foresters out there that don't belong, but to me, it's the only way to really keep up with what's going on a regional basis and even a national basis in forest management. As far as my involvement with SAF, I've always been a member. Of course, since 1961, I was even active as a student member when I was in college. And since being on this forest, I've been involved with various programs that our local chapter has run. The Conservation Days program, as well as other Conservation Day programs run by other cooperators in this area. I had the fortune of being president one year. So I've always been an active participant throughout my career in SAF. I guess in an ideal world, we would have good collaboration with the public to manage forests for their enjoyment and also for the protection of the national forests. I would see you can't manage a forest, I think, without true professional foresters involved. That's what they're trained for. And I think there just needs to be a lot more involvement and action taken because I think the drought and the insect damage that we see now, and we've seen this all over the West. I think several years ago, and maybe even extending now, the Rocky Mountains had a significant insect problem too. I don't know anything about how they handled that, but those are situations that I think could be avoided if we had proactive management funded by Congress up front to deal with those issues, not after the fact. It's always been frustrating to me that Congress is willing to provide dollars to fight for wildfires. If we could take the billions of dollars that we spend every year on fighting wildfires and the reforestation efforts tied into that, if they put that money up front, we'd solve a lot of problems. I think you'd have a more open forest, and you'd have a forest that has a lot of variety in terms of species and sizes of trees and plants and animals. Beyond that, I guess I wouldn't get into any specifics other than that.